Now the farm belonged to Midge. That was the word the bank used. Belonged. Though ownership were a simple matter of names on paper. As though belonging were not something you earned, or fought for, or bled into the ground at 5 a.m. for enough years that the soil began to remember your footfall. She watched Duke from the back porch, coffee going cold in her hand. The morning was April cold, the kind that April in eastern Kentucky produces without apology. Frost still possible at night, sun thin and uncertain in the early hours, the fields brown at the edges where winter had not yet fully released its grip. The dog sat in the far corner of the back pasture, near what her father had always called the rock quarter, that stretch of rough, uneven ground where the land tilted and heaved, and cedar trees had colonized the spaces between limestone outcroppings over several decades of no particular use. Duke sat with his back to the house, facing the stone wall her grandfather had built along the property boundary sometime in the 1930s. The wall had mostly collapsed. Limestone slabs tilted at odd angles, some half-buried, some missing entirely, scattered by decades of frost heave and slow gravity. Beyond it, a ravine dropped toward a creek. Trees, nothing much. Duke was not hunting, was not pointing the way. Hound dogs will sometimes freeze when they have scented something interesting in the brush. He was simply sitting, settled and still and uninterested in everything that was not that particular patch of ground. Midge set her coffee on the porch rail and called his name. He turned, looked at her, turned back. She went inside and did not think about it again until the following morning, when she found him in the same spot. Her father had died in October. James Calloway, 76 years old, found on the kitchen floor by his neighbor Lynette Boggs, who had come over when the mail went uncollected for 3 days, and the lights did not change at night. Heart attack, the doctor said. Fast, probably. He would not have known much. Midge had driven from Cincinnati the next morning 6 hours through the blue ridges of eastern Kentucky, and when she turned down the long gravel drive and saw the farm for the first time in 4 years, something in her chest had shifted. Not grief exactly, something more complicated than that. The farmhouse was a 2-story white clapboard building that had been white once, a long time ago. Now it was the color of old paper, the paint peeling away in long curled strips like something molting. The porch sagged noticeably on the left side. One of the upstairs windows had been covered with plywood where the glass had broken, and her father had not gotten around to replacing it, or had not had the money. The yard was overgrown, the barn needed a new roof, and the equipment shed leaned at an angle that had been concerning 15 years ago and was now genuinely alarming. But the fields were in better shape. Her father had kept the fields, 140 workable acres of bottom ground and hillside that still produced decent hay when the weather cooperated. It was the rock quarter that had always been left alone. 40 acres of rough ground in the southeast corner of the property where the limestone surfaced through the soil and made farming impractical. Her grandfather had used it for light grazing occasionally, but even that had faded over the years. The cedar trees had moved in, the old stone wall had crumbled, and nobody went back there anymore, except hunters in November, and occasionally Duke, who would range through the cedar thickets looking for rabbits and squirrels. The will was straightforward. Midge got the farm. Her brother Dale got the insurance money, $47,000, and her sister Carol got the truck, the tractor, and the contents of the savings account, which came to $8,200. Their father had arranged it this way deliberately. He had talked to his lawyer 6 months before he died and left instructions. Midge got the farm because she was the only one who had ever wanted it. Dale found out the same day Midge did, standing in the lawyer's office in Harlan, and the expression on his face was something Midge had been watching for her entire life. That particular combination of contempt and pity that older siblings deploy when a younger sibling does something they consider naive. Dale was 51, worked in property management in Lexington, and owned a house with a 2-car garage, a lawn service, and a boat he kept on a reservoir 40 minutes from his house. He did not need the farm, but that was not the point. "You're going to lose it," he said, in the parking lot, before the lawyer had even finished copying the paperwork. Not cruel, not angry. Matter of fact, the way he had always said things about Midge's decisions, with the certainty of a man who had appointed himself the family's resident authority on what was realistic. Bank's got 2 liens on it. There's back property taxes. The equipment's worth nothing. You can't run a farm alone. Midge looked at him for a moment. Daddy ran it alone for 12 years after Mom died. Daddy was here. He barely kept it. She did not answer. There was nothing to say. Dale had never understood why the farm mattered, had never stood in the fields at dusk when the light turned the ridgeline the color of old copper, and felt something move through him that did not have a name. He was not a man who felt things that did not have names. He drove away before she had made it back to her car. Carol was gentler about it. Carol always was. She hugged Midge in the parking lot, said she was sorry about all of it. Sorry about Dad, sorry about the whole situation. She called 3 times in the first week to check in. But when Midge mentioned staying on through winter to try to work things out, Carol's voice went careful in the way that voices do when people are trying to be honest without being unkind. "Midge, honey, the debt's substantial. I looked at the numbers when we were there. You'd have to produce a miracle harvest just to make a dent in it. I know what the numbers are. I just mean, there might be a point where letting go is the right thing. It's just land." Midge thanked her and hung up and sat on the sagging porch in the October dark and listened to the farm breathe around her. Creek in the hollow, the wind in the cedar trees. Duke somewhere out in the dark, his tags jingling faintly as he moved through the yard. It's just land. She understood why Carol said it. She even understood that Carol was trying to help. But there was no version of Carol's sentence that made sense to her. The farm was not just land the way a marriage was not just paperwork. Some things are more than their surface. Cannot explain that to someone who only looks at surfaces. She stayed. Margaret Ann Calloway. Midge since she was 3 years old when her father had decided that Margaret was too large a name for someone so small. 44 years old, divorced 7 years prior. 2 children, Ryan, 21, working construction in Louisville, and Amber, 16, who had driven down from Cincinnati with Midge in October and decided, to Midge's surprise, that she wanted to stay. Amber was a quiet, observant girl who had taken her parents' divorce with a seriousness that adults sometimes mistake for resilience, but is actually something else, a private recalibration of what the world can be trusted to provide. She enrolled in the high school in Harlan in November and did not complain about it, which Midge knew was its own kind of sacrifice. Debt was real. 2 liens totaling $84,000, dating from a series of equipment purchases her father had made in the late 1990s when he had still believed he could scale up production. The equipment had not performed well enough. The scaling had not happened. The debt had stayed. There were also unpaid property taxes going back 3 years, $11,400, because her father had been paying down the liens instead, holding the bank at a distance while the county tax office accumulated what it was owed. Gerald Hutchins, the loan officer at First National in Harlan, was a soft-spoken man in his late 50s who wore reading glasses on a lanyard and spoke to Midge the way people speak to someone they have already made peace with losing. Careful, patient, not unkind but certain. 9 months before they moved to foreclose, he had recommended a real estate agent. She had not called. Frank Baxter, her ex-husband, heard about the situation through Ryan and called in November. Frank was a structural engineer in Cincinnati, a precise and methodical man who had loved Midge for 12 years and then stopped, or possibly never started, or possibly the word love had always meant different things to each of them. The divorce had been civil. Frank was not a bad person. He was a person who organized his feelings the way he organized projects, in stages, with clear deliverables and defined outcomes. The farm, and what it meant to Midge, had always been something he could not organize. "You're going to drain your savings," he said on the phone. His voice was measured. "You've got maybe 70,000 left after the settlement. You put that into a failing farm operation and you'll come out with nothing, less than nothing, if the bank moves first. I appreciate your concern, Frank. I'm not trying to upset you. I'm trying to be practical. I know. Ryan's worried. Ryan can call me himself." A pause. "You're going to do what you're going to do." "I am." He did not call again for 6 weeks. Harlan County, Kentucky, county seat bearing the same name as the county, surrounded by ridgelines that the Appalachians had been building for 300 million years, as indifferent to the human activities at their feet as mountains tend to be. Coal country, historically, the seams running through the hills had defined the county's economy and its grief for a century. Coal was largely gone now, or going, and the county had the look of a place still deciding what to become next. The decisions were slow. The people were not. They were mountain people, which meant patient and proud, and not given to the kind of openness that makes strangers feel immediately comfortable. They watched carefully. They had long memories. They formed opinions slowly and updated them slower still. Midge's family had been in Harlan County for 4 generations. That bought her something. But being back after 12 years in Cincinnati, arriving with a teenage daughter and a failed marriage, and a farm that everyone could see was struggling, that cost something at the same time. Small towns run on visible success more than they admit. The Calloways had been solid farm people, nothing spectacular, nothing disreputable. Midge, showing up with debt and no clear plan, introduced a note of uncertainty that the community found uncomfortable. Roy Bassett owned the 400 acres adjacent to the Calloway farm on the eastern side. He was 63, had worked his land his entire adult life, and had a way of delivering observation as helpfulness that Midge had been familiar with since childhood. He appeared in the second week of November, carrying a casserole his wife had made, and he stood at the door while Midge held the dish. "Gonna be hard, keeping that place up alone," he said. James managed because he knew every inch of it. "You've been gone a long time. I grew up here. Growing up and running aren't the same thing." She thanked him for the casserole. He looked past her into the hallway. "Duke around?" "Haven't seen him since the funeral. He's out back." Roy nodded, looked at the porch. "That left side there needs jacking. Before it goes all the way. You let it go much longer, and the whole thing'll have to come off." She knew about the porch. She had known about the porch for 3 weeks. "Thank you, Roy." He went down the steps, stopped at the bottom, and turned back with the expression of a man who has been saving the main point for last. Gerald Hutchins mentioned the situation at the bank. Nothing specific, just. "If you're thinking about selling, there are people who'd be interested. Good land, most of it. The rock quarter's not worth much, but the bottom acres are fine, clear enough to pay the debt and have something left. I'm not selling." He looked at her for a moment, not unkindly, steadily. "The way people look when they believe you are making a mistake and have decided to let you make it." "Well," he said, and left. He was not the only one. Over the months that followed, Midge collected a small and unremarkable archive of doubts. The pharmacist, who had filled her prescriptions since she was small, and who now asked carefully how she was managing out there on her own. The woman at the feed store, who let a half-second silence fall after Midge mentioned staying through spring, long enough to communicate everything. Her son Ryan, who called in February and talked around the subject for 10 minutes before asking, gently, whether she had thought about coming back to Cincinnati. She could stay with him just while she figured things out, as though the farm were a problem to be untangled and set aside. "I'm figuring things out here," she told him, and changed the subject. The hardest was Gerald Hutchins himself in late February when she went in to request a review of the repayment timeline. He had listened with the patience of a man who has held these conversations many times and understands that the kindest thing is to let the other person say everything before delivering the same answer. He looked at her income figures, at the equipment assessment she had brought in, at the projection she had put together over 3 evenings at the kitchen table. Then he took off his reading glasses, set them on the folder, and looked at her with something that was not quite pity and not quite admiration, but lived somewhere between them. "Mrs. Calloway, I can give you through August. That's the furthest I can stretch it with what you've got here." Tapped the projection. "But I want to be honest with you. These numbers assume a hay yield. I'm not confident in given the equipment state and the labor situation. You're a one-woman operation going into summer. The yield assumptions might not hold. I know the land. I believe you do. I also know the land takes more than knowing, in physical terms." He paused. "Have you considered the timber rights on the back section? The cedar and hardwood back there might be something to sell. The rock quarter." "That's the back section?" Yes. She thought about the rock quarter. About the 40 acres of rough ground and cedar thickets and collapsed stone wall that nobody had farmed in decades, that Roy Bassett said was not worth much, that Gerald Hutchins was now suggesting she strip of trees to make a few $1,000s against an $84,000 debt. "I'll think about it," she said. She drove home and went directly to the back porch and stood looking out at the far corner of the pasture. Duke was there, sitting in his spot, turned and looked at her across the distance of the field, and in the particular stillness of a cold February afternoon, she had the irrational but complete sensation that the dog was waiting for her to pay attention. Duke had appeared in the farm lane one August morning nearly a decade before, thin and limping, with no collar and no tags, and the look of a dog who had been on his own long enough to have expectations about it. James Calloway had set out water and a bowl of food, and by evening the dog was on the porch. By the following week, he was inside. He had never been formally named. James had started calling him Duke because of something about his bearing, the unhurried way he moved through the world, and the name stuck the way names do when they are a little too accurate to argue with. Duke had adored her father. After James died, Midge had expected the dog to be unsettled, to pace and wait and watch the door. He had for a week. Then he had stopped waiting and started going to the rock quarter instead. Not ranging through it the way he used to, working through the cedar thickets for rabbits and their particular traces, going to one specific location near the old stone wall and staying there. Midge had assumed at first that he was hunting, but she had walked out to him twice in those first 11 days and found him not hunting, just sitting at the base of a slight depression in the ground near the wall. The depression may be 2 feet lower than the surrounding land, roughly oval in shape, covered in dead grass and cedar litter, and nothing notable. On the 12th day, she walked out with him. She had been meaning to assess the back section anyway. There was timber value in those cedar trees, she knew. not much, but she needed to account for every possible income source. She took a notebook and a pen and told herself it was a practical errand. Duke fell into step beside her immediately, which was unusual. He was not normally a walking-beside-you dog. He ranged ahead or behind or disappeared entirely, and you would hear his tags from across a field. That morning he walked at her knee the entire way, and when they reached the cedar thickets, he went directly to the depression near the collapsed wall and settled down. Midge stood above him and looked at the space. The rock quarter was uneven throughout, heaved and dipped by decades of frost and root pressure and the limestone pushing up from below. But there was something about this particular depression that she could not quite categorize. The surrounding area was random in its unevenness, the kind of randomness that comes from geological time. This depression had edges that were slightly too regular. Not perfectly regular, nothing that would announce itself to a passing glance. But something in the geometry was not quite natural. She sat on a nearby limestone slab and looked at it for a while. Duke watched her. Amber eyes, cloudy now at the edges with age, tracked her face with the patience of an animal that has learned to wait for humans to arrive at things in their own time. She thought about her grandfather. Earl Calloway had been born in 1895 on this farm, on the second floor of the farmhouse, in the room that had later been Midge's when she was a girl. He had farmed the same land his entire life, through 2 world wars and the Depression and the slow changes that turned Kentucky from a place of subsistence farming into something more connected, and in his view considerably less trustworthy. He had been a quiet man. Midge had known him only briefly. She was 9 years old when he died, but she remembered his hands, the way they moved, and a particular stillness about him, the quality of a man who did not speak unless speaking seemed genuinely necessary. Her father had mentioned occasionally that Earl had never trusted banks. Not after 1929, not after watching neighbors lose what they had built to institutions that turned out to be no more stable than the rest of the world. James said this without particular emphasis, the way you repeat family mythology that you have heard enough times to know by heart without ever having examined it closely. Earl was careful with money. He never said more than that. There had been a running question in the family, mostly unspoken, about whether Earl had kept money somewhere on the property. Savings held back, currency converted, value stored in some form that a bank could not claim, was the kind of question that families pass around for decades without anyone actually trying to answer it, because the searching would feel undignified, like going through a dead man's pockets. None of them had searched, as far as Midge knew. She sat on the limestone slab and looked at the oval depression, and thought about her grandfather building that stone wall. He had built it in the 1930s. She knew this from 2 photographs, old black and white prints in a cigar box in the farmhouse, showing the wall under construction. Earl with his shirt off, his arms dark from sun, stacking limestone. Another photo from a different angle, the wall half built, and in the background the cedar trees much smaller, the ground behind them more open. Neither photograph had she ever thought about what was beneath the ground. She stood up. Duke stood up beside her. "I need a shovel," she told him, and walked back to the house. She did not tell Amber. She told herself it was because Amber was in school and she did not want to make something of what was probably nothing. But honestly, it was also that the idea felt fragile, and fragile things do not survive being talked about before they are real. She got the round point shovel from the equipment shed and walked back out to the rock quarter alone. Duke was waiting at the depression. Midge pressed the shovel blade into the earth at the edge of the oval and stood on the step. The ground resisted, as April soil does, still dense from winter, not yet softened by the spring rains that were still some weeks off. She worked the blade back and forth, put her weight into it, brought up a first clod of dark earth and cedar roots. She dug for an hour that first morning. Rocky, as expected for the rock quarter, but not impossibly so. There were pockets of deeper loam between the limestone outcroppings, and the depression itself seemed to follow those pockets. After an hour, she had a rough trench 18 inches deep and 3 feet long along the eastern edge of the oval. Nothing. She stopped and rested and drank from the water bottle she had brought. Duke had settled a few feet away, watching with the patient attention of a dog that has made a bet and is waiting to see it pay off. She went back to it. On the second day, she worked along the southern edge and found something different. The soil came away in a shape that had no business being that shape. Not rock, not root. The shovel edge met something flat and broad, a surface rather than a mass, and the sound the blade made when it contacted was not the dull thud of stone on stone, but something marginally hollower. She stopped and dropped to her knees and cleared the soil with her hands. Flat stone, large. A single piece of limestone, roughly 3 feet wide by 4 feet long, that had been dressed on its upper surface. Not the rough broken face of natural limestone, but a deliberate cut, smooth under her fingers, the edges straight, was sitting level, not heaved by frost, not tilted by root pressure, level as though placed with care. She ran her hands across the top and felt the edge of another stone beside it, the same dressed limestone, the same careful placement. The seam between them filled with old mortar, not the crumbling powder of the wall above ground, but something denser, more deliberately mixed, applied with patience. She sat back on her heels and looked at what she had uncovered. Her grandfather had worked stone his entire life. The walls on the farm, the old foundation of the barn that had burned sometime in the 1950s, a low retaining wall along the garden path that her father had maintained long after the garden was gone. Earl Calloway had known how to dress limestone and set it and seal it. That was not unusual for a Kentucky farm man of his generation and his inclinations. This flat, level surface, this careful mortar, was not incidental work. This was built to last. She covered the stones back with soil as carefully as she could, tamped it down, and stood to look at the shape of the depression from above. Oval, slightly regular edges, approximately 10 feet by 7. Limestone dressed and set level and sealed with mortar under 2 feet of earth and 60 years of cedar litter. A floor, or a roof, the top of something built underground. Duke trotted over and stood beside her, his shoulder warm against her knee. He drove to the hardware store in Harlan that afternoon. She bought a longer pry bar, a wider spade, a pair of good leather gloves, and a flashlight with fresh batteries. She paid cash. She did not tell the man behind the counter what she was doing, and he did not ask, because this was Harlan County, and people had generally minded their own for longer than anyone could remember. On the drive home, she stopped at the overlook on Route 1 and 19, where the valley opened below and the ridgeline ran north, dark with tree cover. She sat in the truck with the engine running and thought about Earl Calloway, quiet, careful, deliberate, a man who built walls and did not explain himself. A man who had made his farm survive the Depression not by luck, but by managing every resource he had with a precision that his neighbors called tight-fistedness and that his family called careful. Earl had put something away. He had not put it in a bank. He had put it somewhere that the bank could not reach it. Drove home. The next 3 mornings she went out before Amber woke for school, moving through the dark yard with her flashlight pointed low. She dug systematically, clearing soil from the upper surface of the limestone structure, widening her trench around the perimeter to determine the full dimensions of what was underneath. It was larger than she had estimated. The limestone cap extended nearly 12 feet on its longest axis, 10 feet wide, the seams between the cut stones all carefully mortared, the surface level within a fraction of an inch throughout. 6 stones in total made up the cap, laid in 2 rows of 3, each piece roughly 2 feet thick. She stood and did the arithmetic in her head. Combined weight of those 6 stones was substantial. Moving them into position had required equipment, or many men working together with a shared understanding of the plan. Not something done in an afternoon or in secret, something organized, something carried out over time with the kind of deliberateness that her grandfather had applied to everything he built. She found the east edge on the 4th day. The limestone cap sat atop a course of set fieldstone, irregularly shaped but carefully fitted, which in turn sat atop another course. She scraped soil from the east face of the structure and counted the courses with her fingers. 4 visible. The structure went down at least 4 feet from the underside of the limestone cap, and probably deeper because she could not see where it ended. On the 5th morning she found the door. Not a door as she had imagined, not hinged wood, not rusted metal. A section of fieldstone wall on the north face laid in a slightly different pattern from the surrounding courses, the stones a little more regularly shaped, the seams running in a configuration that distinguished it from the rest of the wall face. She tapped along it with the handle of the pry bar. The sound changed at a seam running roughly 18 inches from the east end. She tapped again above and below that line. Above solid, below different. Faint, hollow quality she would have missed if she had not been listening for it. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money, it's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases, because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. She stood with the pry bar in her hands and felt the specific kind of stillness that comes before a thing that cannot be undone. Not danger, the structure was solid. It was the understanding that in a few minutes she was going to know something she currently did not know, and whatever she found would be permanent. It would be the truth, fixed and real, and she would carry it from this point forward no matter what it was. Duke sat at her feet. She worked the tip of the pry bar into the seam below the dividing line, felt it catch on something that shifted slightly. Not mortar, metal. A bar or pin set horizontally into the stone. She worked it carefully, not forcing anything, reading the resistance with her hands the way her father had taught her to read soil by pressing it between her fingers. The pin was not rusted solid, it moved. She worked it back and forth, millimeters at a time, and after 20 minutes it pulled free. She found the second pin on the opposite side and worked it out the same way. The section of fieldstone was not a door in any conventional sense. It was a plug, a carefully fitted piece of masonry designed to fill an opening precisely, held in place by 2 iron pins set into channels in the surrounding stone. She got her hands under the bottom edge and pulled. It did not come easily. 60 years of compression and mineral bonding had fixed the edges into the surrounding stone in ways that required patience. She worked the pry bar around the perimeter, breaking the bond fraction by fraction, stopping when something bound too hard, and moving to another section. Duke stood up. He did not move closer. He simply stood, the way dogs stand when something significant is happening, and they understand that their role in it is already complete. The plug shifted. Then it came free, an opening in the north face of the structure. Roughly 18 inches wide, 30 inches tall, enough to pass through on hands and knees if she turned sideways. The air that came out was cold, dry, and smelled of limestone and something else underneath, something faintly metallic, ancient in a way she had no clear word for. Midge got on her knees in front of the opening and pointed the flashlight inside. The beam lit the interior in a long oval. Stone floor, swept clean once and now filmed with fine silt. Stone walls, the same fieldstone construction. A ceiling of stone about 5 feet from the floor. She would need to stay crouched to move inside. The space was larger than the opening suggested. She could not see the far wall. What she could see in the near half of the chamber were shapes. The shapes were covered in canvas and burlap, old cloth gone dark with age. Most of it lay flat, but some bulged upward in ways that indicated weight and density rather than hollow emptiness. Against the near wall stood a series of wooden crates, old slat-sided boxes, the kind used for everything from fruit to ammunition in an earlier century, stacked 3 high in 2 columns. Beside the crates, wrapped objects, roughly cylindrical, a dozen of them at least, standing upright against the wall. Beside those, flat metal boxes stacked on a low shelf of stone that ran the length of the interior. Midge sat back on her heels and looked at what her flashlight was showing her. Duke made a sound she had never heard from him before, not a growl, not a bark. Something low and soft and almost contented, as though whatever he had been waiting 11 days to show her had finally been seen, and the thing he owed was now paid. Her hands had stopped shaking. That was the strange part. The closer she had gotten to this moment, the steadier she had become, as though her body had decided that the moment of truth was not a place for trembling. She felt calm in a way that did not feel like numbness. It felt like ground under her feet. She stayed outside the opening for a while, breathing the cool, cedar-smelling morning air. The day was full light, April sun thin but present, birds working through the trees somewhere nearby. She could hear the creak in the hollow below the rock quarter. The same creek she had played in at 10 years old when her grandfather was still alive, and the farm had seemed to her the fixed center of everything. She thought about Earl Calloway, his inward curved hands, his stillness, his reputation for being careful with money. She thought about Gerald Hutchins and his reading glasses and his measured voice telling her she had 9 months. She thought about Roy Bassett saying the rock quarter was not worth much. Then she crawled through the opening, turned sideways, got to her feet inside. The chamber was approximately 15 feet deep by 10 feet wide, and she could stand if she did not straighten fully. She swept the flashlight beam slowly from left to right. The far wall held more crates, more wrapped shapes, more flat metal boxes. The second low shelf ran the full length of the far wall, stacked along its entire length. Whatever Earl Calloway had put here, he had been doing it for a long time. She crossed to the nearest crate and lifted a corner of the old burlap. Beneath it, a slat-sided wooden box once used for fruit, now repurposed. The slats had gaps between them. She pointed the flashlight through one and looked inside. What she saw was the color of old gold, not metaphorical gold, Actual gold, coins stacked in neat columns inside cloth rolls that had aged and softened. Dozens of them in this box alone, she estimated. Maybe more. The flashlight beam caught the edge of a coin where one of the cloth rolls had loosened at the end. Large. Thick. She had seen photographs of St. Gaudens's double eagles in an antique reference book she had bought years ago for no reason she had ever been able to articulate. She had looked at the photographs and put the book on a shelf. That was what the color was. She set the corner of the burlap back down very carefully. She moved to the cylindrical wrapped objects standing against the wall. She unwrapped the top of the nearest one and found silver, a stacked column of silver dollars, sleeved in old cloth that crumbled at her touch, each coin the size of her palm. Morgan dollars, she recognized them from the reference photographs in her memory, struck between 1878 and 1904. She had no idea what they were worth individually. Multiplied by how many she was looking at, the dozen cylinders against this wall, more along the far wall, the number was beyond what she could calculate, standing in a dim stone chamber with her hands shaking. She moved to the flat metal boxes on the stone shelf. The first one she tried was locked, a small brass padlock, old but not corroded through. The second was not locked. She lifted the lid. Inside folded papers, not currency, not bonds, but papers. Handwritten, her grandfather's hand again, inventories, lists, dates and quantities, and descriptions in a handwriting so compressed it would take time to read properly. She could make out enough. Column headings, categories, amounts. Earl Calloway had been keeping records. She stood up, turned, put her back against the cool stone wall, and looked at the chamber around her. The crates, and the wrapped shapes, and the flat metal boxes on their stone shelves. The floor swept clean once by hands that had been dead for 56 years. At the second shelf along the far wall, stacked in the same patient way, box after box, cylinder after cylinder, the compressed inventory of a long and careful life. She thought about how many years it must have taken. How many small decisions not to spend, not to trust, not to declare. How many early mornings when Earl had walked back here alone before the farm woke and added something to what he was building underground. The chamber had not been filled in a season or a year. It had been filled across decades, quietly, in the rock quarter that nobody farmed and nobody valued and everybody left alone. Her father had not known. She was certain of that. James had known. He would have said something in those final years when the debt was building and the options were narrowing. He would have said something. Earl had taken the secret with him in 1968, and the cedar trees had grown tall above the limestone cap, and the old stone wall had crumbled further, and the rock quarter had been left to itself. And then her father had died, and a 10-year-old hound with a gray muzzle had chosen a spot and refused to leave it. Inside, Duke barked once, soft, not alarmed. Something more like acknowledgement, as though a long wait had finally resolved. She stayed inside for a long time, not touching anything else, just looking. Then she crawled back out into the morning light and stood in the spring air and felt the specific weight of what she was carrying. She needed to know more before she spoke to anyone. That was the one thing she was certain of. Not from secrecy, that was not how she had been raised, but from practicality. She had no idea what was in those crates and boxes beyond what the flashlight had suggested. She had no idea what it was worth. She had no idea what the legal situation was, whether items found buried on your own land were straightforwardly yours, or whether there were claims and procedures and complications she could not yet foresee. She needed information. She drove to the county library in Harlan that afternoon while Amber was still in school. The librarian, a woman near her father's age named Mrs. Combs, helped her find what she needed without asking why she needed it. That was one of the reliable virtues of small-town librarians. Mrs. Combs pulled reference books on numismatics, on the history of United States gold coinage, on the Treasury Gold Reserve Act of 1934, and what it had meant for private gold ownership during the Depression years. She found the Kentucky statutes governing found property on privately owned land. She spent 3 hours reading. What she found in those hours rearranged something in her understanding of her grandfather's life. She had known Earl Calloway as a child knows an elderly relative, as a permanent, weathered feature of the landscape, defined by a few repeated images and stories rather than by the full complexity of a human being. The man who set limestone, the man who did not trust banks, the man who rose before dawn and went to bed at dark and did not believe in waste of any kind, not of food, not of materials, not of words. What she had not known, and what the history books gave her in slow accumulating detail, was the specific texture of what the Depression had done to people like Earl. She read about the bank failures of 1929 and 1930 and 1931, about the runs on rural banks in Kentucky and Tennessee and all through Appalachia, about families who had deposited modest lifetime savings and received nothing back when the institution closed its doors. She read about farmers who had watched their neighbors lose farms to foreclosure and had made personal vows, private and unannounced, to never put themselves in the same position. She read about the particular psychology of men who had survived that period. The deep distrust of paper money, the preference for tangible assets, the belief that what you could hold in your hand was the only wealth that could not be taken from you in the night. Earl Calloway would have been 34 years old in 1929, old enough to understand exactly what was happening, old enough to make decisions about it that would shape the rest of his life. She thought about the photographs in the cigar box, the wall being built in the 1930s, the cedar trees young behind it, the ground open. A man who had decided at some point in those terrible years to build something that the bank could not foreclose on. A man who had the skills and the patience and the secrecy to do it right. The Treasury Gold Reserve Act. She had not known the specific history, though she had a vague sense of it. In 1933, President Roosevelt had issued an executive order requiring citizens to surrender most of their privately held gold coins to Federal Reserve banks in exchange for paper currency. The intention was to prevent hoarding and stabilize the national currency during the banking crisis. Most people complied, but not everyone. Rural areas particularly, among people who had already watched banks fail and institutions fail and systems fail in 1929, some held on to what they had built, buried it. They built chambers and root cellars and hidden spaces. The government had rarely gone looking, and the law had been modified incrementally and eventually reversed over the following decades. By 1974, it was fully legal again to own gold coins in any quantity. Pre-1933, coins with established numismatic value above their gold content had generally been exempt from the original surrender requirement. St. Gaudens double eagles, the $20 denomination struck at the United States Mint from 1849 to 1933, were among the most collected and most valuable American gold coins. The 1933 issues were the final year of production and among the scarcest. Auction records in the reference books she found showed individual specimens selling for tens of thousands of dollars at major numismatic auctions, with exceptional examples reaching higher. She wrote down what she read. Her handwriting changed over the course of the afternoon, got smaller and more controlled, the letters pressing closer together the way writing does when the hand is working to keep pace with a mind that will not slow down. Under Kentucky property law, items found on privately owned land were generally considered the property of the landowner, with exceptions for designated archaeological sites and certain other categories that did not apply here. Buried personal property placed by a deceased prior owner with no surviving heirs holding an identified claim fell under the general finder's rule. She wrote that down. She drove home in the early evening with a legal pad full of notes and the particular quietness that comes when you know something enormous and are not ready yet to do anything with it. Amber was at the kitchen table doing homework. She looked up when Midge came in, read her mother's face with the accuracy that 16 years of close observation develops, and set her pencil down. "What happened?" Amber said. Midge set her bag on the counter. She sat down across from her daughter. She picked up one of Amber's pencils and set it back down. "I need to show you something tomorrow morning," she said. "Before school." Amber looked at her steadily. "Is it good or bad?" Midge thought about the chamber. Color of old gold through a gap in old slat wood, the flat metal boxes on stone shelves, the floor swept clean once by her grandfather's hands. Earl Calloway's handwritten inventories in compressed, careful script. Duke sitting outside with his soft sound of acknowledgement. "I don't know yet," she said. "I think it might be something remarkable." Amber did not press for more. She understood, in the way she understood most things, that her mother would tell her what she needed to her when the time was right, and that asking before then served no one. She went back to her homework. Midge made dinner, and they ate, and Amber talked about school in the easy circling way she had, and Midge listened and nodded and held what she knew quietly inside her chest. After Amber went to bed, Midge sat at the kitchen table with the legal pad and went through her notes again. She added new ones beside them. Questions for tomorrow. Names of people she would eventually need to call. Numismatist, a property attorney. Someone from the State Historical Society, perhaps, if any of what was in those flat metal boxes turned out to be documents rather than currency. She wrote and crossed out and rewrote in the careful way of someone who has learned that the difference between a plan and wishful thinking is the willingness to account for what you do not know. 10 o'clock, she turned off the kitchen light, walked to the window, and looked out at the dark field. She could not see the rock quarter from here. Just the near pasture, the outline of the barn against the lighter dark of the sky, and Duke's shape on the porch, already sleeping, his work done. Her grandfather had built something under 4 feet of Kentucky limestone and left it to the land and the years and the silence. And the land had kept it, the way land keeps things, without judgment or preference, simply holding what was placed into it until someone came to look. The next morning she walked Amber to the depression in the rock quarter while the light was still early and gray. Duke came with them, pressed close to Midge's left leg in a way that felt, though she knew it was projection, proprietary, as though the dog were escorting them both to something he had been protecting without knowing why. Amber said nothing during the walk. She was a child who processed best in silence, who needed to see a thing before she could begin to feel about it. Midge uncovered the opening. She had replaced the plug loosely the day before and handed Amber the flashlight and let her look inside for herself. Amber was quiet for a long time after that, not startled, not jumping, just looking. Careful inventory in the serious, methodical way she had. "How much?" she said finally. "I don't know. I need to get someone in here who can tell me." Amber turned and looked at her mother. The morning light caught the side of her face. She was 16, slight, with her father's precision about her features and her mother's stillness in the eyes. She said it quietly but without hesitation. "Mom, this is ours. Not a question. A claim." Said the way young people sometimes understand before adults do that they have a right to something. Not because the law says so, though the law did, but because something older than the law says so. Midge looked at her daughter. "Yes," she said, "it is." Dukes settled onto the ground beside the opening, laid his gray muzzle on his paws, and closed his eyes. She did not call anyone that day, or the day after. She needed time to think through the order of things, and thinking through the order of things was something Midge had always done slowly and on her own. It was the same quality that Frank had once called stubbornness, and that her father had called deliberate. And she had long since decided that her father's word was the more accurate one. She sat with the legal pad at the kitchen table on both evenings and worked through what she knew and what she needed, and what the correct sequence was for turning what she had found into something that could not be taken from her. The first thing she needed was documentation. Not her documentation, Earl's. The handwritten inventories in the flat metal boxes were the key to that, and she had not yet read them properly. Afternoon of the second day, she went back to the chamber alone, without Duke this time, and retrieved both metal boxes that were not locked. She carried them to the house, wrapped in a clean feed sack, set them on the kitchen table, and sat down with a cup of tea and the patience she had inherited from the same man who had written what she was about to read. Earl's handwriting was small and compressed. The kind of handwriting that comes from a person who regards paper as a resource not to be wasted. He had used every inch of the pages, leaving almost no margin, the lines dense and even. The ink had faded to a brown that was still perfectly legible. She started from the beginning of the first volume. Earliest entry was dated March 14, 1933. He had written, "Converted last of the paper currency. 24 double eagles, Liberty Head, all in fine condition or better. Placed in box 1. Total gold holdings now 87 coins. She put the tea down and read that again. 87 coins in March of 1933. He had been building this since before the Depression, had been converting paper money to gold for years before Roosevelt's executive order changed the rules. He had not panicked in 1933. He had simply continued doing what he had already been doing, with the calm of a man who had anticipated that the world would eventually behave the way it had behaved. She turned the pages carefully. Inventories continued with the same compressed regularity, entry after entry across years. Each one noted what had been acquired, what form it took, the date it was placed in the chamber. Gold coins came in batches of modest size, 5 here, 12 there, occasionally 2 or 3. Silver dollars came in larger quantities. Bonds purchased through the mail appeared periodically, described with the same factual brevity. Cash in specific denominations noted and counted and placed in sealed tins. Every few pages, a summary line. Total gold holdings as of this date, followed by a number that grew with the patient accumulation of years. She read for 3 hours. Duke came and settled under the table at her feet. By 1945, the gold holdings had reached 312 coins. By 1955, 401. The final entry she found, dated September 2, 1967, 14 months before Earl died, recorded a total of 447 gold coins, 2,840 silver dollars, 11 Series E war bonds from the 1940s still unredeemed, and $312 in cash in a sealed tin. And at the bottom of the final page, in handwriting that was slightly less controlled than the earlier entries, the tremor of age visible in the letters, a single line that was not an inventory entry. For the farm, for James, for whoever comes after. Midge sat with that line for a long time. He had known her father's name. Of course he had. James was his son. But the line was not addressed to James alone. Whoever comes after. Earl had not been certain James would find it, or that James would be the one who needed it. He had built a chamber and filled it across 40 years and written an inventory of everything in it. and hidden it 3 feet below a limestone cap, in the corner of his land that nobody wanted. And he had left a note at the end that was addressed to the future rather than to any specific person. The future had turned out to be Midge. She folded her hands on the table and looked at the inventory pages spread in front of her. Outside the kitchen window, the April dark had settled over the farm. She could hear the wind in the cedar trees from across the fields, the same sound it had made when she was a girl in this house, when Earl was still alive, and his silence had seemed to her simply the natural silence of old men, rather than the silence of someone who knew something he was not ready to say. The second thing she needed was someone who could tell her what it was worth. Not a general appraiser, someone who understood numismatics specifically, who knew what gold coins in original condition from the late 19th and early 20th centuries traded for in the current market, who could look at what Earl had accumulated and give her a number she could defend. She did not want to call anyone she knew locally. Not yet. Not until she had documentation and a formal appraisal in hand, because once the word was in the county, it would move the way words move in small counties, fast and without mercy. And she needed to be standing on solid ground before that happened. She drove to the library again and asked Mrs. Combs for help finding a numismatic appraiser, someone established with verifiable credentials. Mrs. Combs did not ask why. She pulled out a reference directory and within 20 minutes had found 3 names. Midge wrote them down, thanked her, and drove home. The first 2 were too far. The third was in Lexington. Warren Elst, certified numismatist, 40 years in the field, member of the American Numismatic Association, currently operating a small appraisal practice out of his home after retiring from a larger firm. The directory listing was brief. The professional credentials were extensive. She called him from the kitchen telephone on a Thursday evening. He answered on the 3rd ring. His voice was older, deliberate, with the particular precision of a man who has spent 4 decades choosing his words to match the exact thing he means to say. She told him she had found a collection on her family's property. Pre-1933 gold coins, Morgan silver dollars, other items. She thought the collection was substantial. She needed a professional appraisal and a written report. She was not interested in selling through him. She simply needed to know what she had. There was a brief pause on his end. How substantial is substantial? I'd rather you see it and tell me. Another pause, shorter. How soon? They arranged it for the following Tuesday. She gave him directions to the farm and told him to come in the morning. She did not tell him the size of the chamber or what she had read in the inventories. She told him enough to bring the right equipment and not enough to generate speculation. After she hung up, she sat at the table and made a list of everything she needed to do before Tuesday. Cover the excavation with a tarp to keep the rain out. Prepare a proper inventory of what she could see from the entrance without disturbing anything. Find the largest flatbed she could borrow to carry equipment if Warren needed lifting assistance with the limestone cap. She added each item to the list with a line beside it for checking off, the way her father had always made lists. Because her father had learned it from Earl, and Earl had believed that a task unwritten was a task half forgotten. Amber watched her from the doorway. "Are you going to be all right?" Midge looked up. "I'm making a list." "You make lists when you're nervous." "I make lists when there's a lot to do." Amber came in and sat across from her, the same chair she had used for homework every night since October, and looked at her mother with the steady observation she had always brought to things she could not yet categorize. "You think Grandpa knew about what Great-Grandpa built back there?" Midge thought about the final line in Earl's inventory. "For James, for whoever comes after. I think your grandfather left the Rock Quarter alone his whole life Because his father told him to, she said. I don't think he knew what was in it. I think Earl kept that to himself. Why? Midge considered this for a while. I think some people believe that telling diminishes things. A secret kept long enough becomes something else, becomes solid, becomes a kind of promise the earth is holding for you. Your great-grandfather was that kind of person. Amber turned this over. That's a lonely way to be. Yes, Midge agreed, it is. Warren Elst arrived Tuesday morning in a 10-year-old Buick with a case of measuring equipment, a portable scale, a loop, a reference library in 2 canvas bags, a digital camera, and the deliberate, unhurried movements of a man who has been doing this long enough to know that hurrying produces errors. He was 68, compact, with white hair cut short and reading glasses he kept on throughout the walk to the rock quarter. He did not say much during the walk. He listened while Midge described what she had found and how she had found it, and he asked one question. You haven't moved anything from its original position? I've opened 2 of the unlocked metal boxes. I moved 1 coin roll to see what it contained and replaced it. Nothing else. He nodded. Good. At the depression. He looked at the excavation for a long time before he descended to examine the opening. He ran his hands along the limestone cap, examined the fieldstone courses, looked at the mortar in the seams, and at the section of fieldstone she had removed and replaced. Crouched at the opening and looked inside with a flashlight he had brought himself, larger and brighter than hers. Did not go in immediately. He looked for perhaps 5 minutes, moving the beam slowly, methodically, from wall to wall and floor to ceiling. Then he sat back on his heels and turned to look at her. How long has this been here? My grandfather built it, I believe, starting around 1929 or 1930. The last inventory entry I found is dated 1967. He died in 1968. Warren looked back at the opening. 40 years of accumulation, approximately. He was quiet for a moment. Duke was sitting at Midge's knee with his usual patience, watching the stranger with neither welcome nor hostility. All right, Warren said. Let me go in. She had arranged with Roy Bassett's son to borrow a farm jack and a series of wooden cribbing blocks, telling him she needed to lift a section of stone wall that had fallen onto a fence post. Roy's son had lent them without questions. She had not told Roy Bassett himself because Roy Bassett would have wanted to know more than she was ready to say. Warren worked inside the chamber for most of the morning. He documented everything in place first, photographing each wall, each shelf, each crate, and wrapped object before touching anything. Then he began opening and examining, starting with the nearest crate and moving systematically across the chamber. Midge stayed outside, sitting on a limestone slab with Earl's inventory pages in her lap, matching what Warren called out to her against what her grandfather had recorded. The numbers matched, not approximately, precisely. Every crate Warren opened corresponded to an inventory entry. Every coin roll counted. Silver cylinders along the walls, the flat metal boxes on the shelves, the sealed cash tins, all of it was there in exactly the quantities and conditions Earl had noted in his compressed, careful hand. The man had kept a perfect record of everything he had built, and nothing had been disturbed in the 56 years since his final entry. At one point, Warren called out a question from inside the chamber. Cash tins. Your grandfather's notes specify $312. Do you have a date for that entry? September 1967. A brief pause. The cash itself is face value, obviously, but I want to note it separately, because some of the bill denominations he listed in an earlier entry are pre-1950 series, which have minor collector value above face. How minor? Marginal, but I like complete. That was Warren Elst, in brief, methodical, precise, interested in the complete picture, not as a matter of procedure, but as a matter of conviction. He emerged periodically to note things in his own ledger, his handwriting small and deliberate, and each time he came out, she could see in his face the particular expression of a professional who has found something that exceeds what he expected to find. He controlled it well, but it was there. At noon, Warren came out, brushed dust from his knees, and accepted the sandwich Midge had brought. He ate standing, which she recognized as the behavior of a man whose mind was still working on something else. "What's your preliminary read?" she asked. He took a breath, set down the water bottle she had also brought. "I want to be careful about numbers until I can do the full written assessment. Market values for coins like these fluctuate, and condition grades affect price significantly. I need to go through everything properly before I can give you a defensible figure." "I understand. I'm not asking for a number to take to a bank. I'm asking for your honest preliminary impression." Warren looked at the chamber opening, then at the inventory pages in her lap, then at her. He had the expression of a man who has spent 40 years being careful with his words and is about to be less careful than usual because the situation seems to warrant it. "Gold coins are what drives the value here," he said. "You've got 447 of them, if your grandfather's count was accurate, and so far everything I've opened matches his count exactly. The majority appear to be Liberty Head double eagles and St. Gaudens double eagles from the 1890s through 1928. Several batches I've examined are in what I'd grade as very fine to extremely fine condition. These were coins stored properly from the day they were acquired. No circulation wear beyond what they had when your grandfather bought them." He paused. Midge waited. "Current market for that volume and that grade range, the gold alone is a significant sum. The Morgan silver dollars are an additional category, roughly 2,800 still to verify, but the ones I've opened are in comparable condition. The war bonds are redeemable. I'll need to calculate their current value. The cash is face value only." "Warren," she said, "a range, that's all." He looked at her for a long moment. "Based on what I've seen this morning and understanding that the full assessment may adjust this considerably, I would estimate the collection in a range between $1.4 million and $2.2 million. Possibly higher if there are any exceptional specimens I haven't reached yet." The morning was very quiet around them. A bird worked through the cedar trees somewhere nearby. The creek in the hollow below made its steady sound. Midge said nothing for a while. She looked at the rock quarter, at the limestone cap and the cedar trees and the collapsed stone wall, at the 40 acres that Roy Bassett had told her were not worth much. "When can you have the written assessment?" 3 weeks. "I'll need to complete the in situ examination today and tomorrow, then do the grading and market comparison research at my office." 3 weeks is careful. 2.5 if you need it sooner. 3 weeks is fine. Warren went back into the chamber. Midge sat on the limestone slab and thought about Earl Calloway and his compressed handwriting and his 40 years of quiet accumulation, and she felt something that was not triumph and not relief, but some third thing that combined elements of both without being either. Something that had no clean name, the way certain truths about your own family never quite resolve into emotions you can label. Warren returned the next day and finished his in situ examination. He spent 7 hours in the chamber, photographing every coin, grading samples from each crate against his reference guides, counting the silver dollars with the methodical patience of a man who knows that accuracy at this stage determines everything downstream. Duke watched from his position near the entrance. By 4 in the afternoon, Warren had climbed out for the last time, packed his equipment into the canvas bags, and shaken Midge's hand with a formality that suggested he understood the weight of what he had spent 2 days documenting. 3 weeks, he said. I'll have everything in writing. I watched him drive down the farm lane and turn onto the county road. The Buick disappeared behind the tree line. The farm was quiet again. She spent the next 2 weeks doing something she had not done since October. She worked the farm without the weight of emergency. She repaired the fence in the south pasture, the work she had been putting off because the equipment she needed had been sitting at the back of her mental ledger of problems she could not yet afford to solve. She ordered the part she needed, paid for it from her remaining savings, and fixed the fence herself over 2 days. She jacked the left side of the porch with borrowed equipment and set a new post under it, following her father's instructions from a note in his maintenance book. She cleaned out the equipment shed, organized what was worth keeping, and cataloged what needed replacement. The work felt different than it had in October and November and the long, cold months in between. Physical tasks were the same: fence posts, porch jacking, equipment shed organization, but the quality of attention she brought to them had changed. In the fall, she had been working against something, against the debt and the clock, and the accumulating evidence that everyone around her believed the outcome was already decided. She was working towards something, and the difference was not subtle. Her back still ached at the end of the day, her hands still blistered in the places the work tools found them, but the ache and the blisters settled differently into sleep. Felt like progress rather than survival. Amber noticed. She did not say so directly. That was not her way. But one evening she looked up from her homework and said that the farm looked different lately, and Midge asked different how, and Amber thought about it and said like it knows it's staying. Midge did not have an answer for that, so she poured herself another cup of tea and went back to what she was reading and let the observation sit where it had landed. She did not tell anyone about Warren Elst or the chamber, not Roy Bassett, not Mrs. Combs, not Ryan when he called from Louisville on a Sunday evening. Amber was the only one who knew, and Amber had said on the morning after Warren's second visit that she was not going to say anything at school until her mother said it was time. She had not asked when that would be. She was 16 and she understood waiting. The hardest part of the 2 weeks was Gerald Hutchins calling on the second Friday. Not an unusual call, he checked in monthly. But hearing his measured voice on the phone, hearing the careful language of a man counting down toward a deadline he had already accepted, was more difficult now than it had been in February. She knew things he did not know. She was holding a change in the conversation that had not yet arrived, and the tension of holding it while answering his questions in the ordinary way required more effort than she had expected. She told him everything was progressing. She told him she was working on it. Both were true, in the strict sense. He told her he appreciated her persistence. He said it in the way that people say they appreciate something when they believe the persistence will ultimately prove insufficient. She thanked him and hung up and went outside and stood with Duke for a while in the late April afternoon. The written assessment arrived on a Wednesday 3 weeks, and 1 day after Warren's second visit. Midge collected the envelope from the mailbox at the end of the farm lane and brought it inside and set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a few minutes before opening it. She had not been anxious about the contents. Warren was methodical. His preliminary estimate was based on the same evidence the written report would be based on. But there was something about the envelope itself, the weight of it, the formality of what it contained, that made her want to take a breath before she read it. The report was 14 pages, detailed, precise, with photographs and individual coin grades and market comparisons and footnotes to current auction records. Warren had numbered every item in the collection. He had written condition notes for every crate of coins and cross-referenced each entry against Earl's original inventory, noting where the two records agreed, which was everywhere, and noting the current market values for each category. She read the entire report twice, straight through, before she turned to the final page. The assessed fair market value of the complete Calloway collection, as Warren had titled it in the header, was $1,840,000. He had also noted that 3 specific coins in the gold grouping had characteristics suggesting they might be from the 1927D and 1920S, Denver and San Francisco Mint runs, which were among the scarcer St. Gaudens Double Eagle issues. Those 3 coins were submitted to the professional coin grading service and confirmed at the grade he estimated they could add between $60,000 and $90,000 to the total above their base market price, $1,840,000. She set the report down and looked out the kitchen window at the back pasture. Duke was in the yard, lying in the sun in the particular way of old dogs who have earned their comfort, all 4 legs extended, chin on the ground. Behind him, just visible at the edge of the field, the cedar trees of the rock quarter moved slightly in the late spring wind. She thought about $84,000 in bank liens. She thought about $11,400 in back property taxes. She thought about the 9 months that had been given to her in Gerald Hutchins's careful, measured voice. She added up what she owed. She subtracted it from $1,840,000. The number that remained was $1,744,600, plus the possible additional value on the 3 coins Warren had flagged, plus whatever the chamber itself represented as a documented historical site. She had not even begun to think about that. She picked up the telephone. She called Warren Elst. He answered on the second ring. "I received it," she said. "Good." He waited. "The 3 coins you flagged. How do I submit them for grading?" He walked her through it. The professional coin grading service, the submission process, the turnaround time. He gave her the name of the contact he used and told her he would be glad to handle the submission on her behalf if she wanted his help. She said yes. She thanked him. She told him his work had been exceptional. After she hung up, she sat at the table for a long time. She thought about her grandfather at 34 years old in 1929, watching the world crack open around him, watching his neighbors lose what they had built, deciding quietly and without announcement that he was going to build something that the cracking world could not reach. He had started with 87 coins. He had spent 40 years adding to them, had written it all down in a handwriting so small and precise it looked like the work of trying to make himself legible to the future, because he could not be certain the future would come to read him. He had built a chamber under the rock quarter that nobody farmed and nobody valued, and he had covered it with limestone that his own hands had cut and dressed, and he had sealed it with mortar. He had mixed himself to a formula that would hold for decades, and then he had let the cedar trees grow over it and said nothing and died with the knowledge folded inside him like one of his inventory pages. Had done it for the farm, for his son, for whoever came after. She was whoever came after. She called Ryan that evening. He answered on the first ring, which told her he had been expecting the call. He always knew when something was coming, had always had her number in that particular way. "Ryan," she said, "I need you to come down this weekend." A pause. "Is something wrong?" "No. Something is very right. But I need you here." He came Saturday morning. He walked out to the rock quarter with her and Amber and Duke, and she showed him the chamber, and he stood at the entrance with the flashlight for a long time without speaking. He was 21 and built like his father, with the same precise way of standing, but something in his expression when he turned around was entirely his own. Something that came from the Calloway side, from the same place where Midge's stubborn quietness lived. "Mom," he said, "this is ours. Your sister said the same thing." He looked at her. "Have you called the bank?" "I'm calling Monday morning." He nodded. He did not ask about the number. He was his mother's son in the way that mattered. He understood that certain things were told in their own order and at their own time, and that pressing served nothing. Picked up the written assessment from where Midge had set it on the limestone slab and read the final page. He read it once. He looked up. He read it again. She watched his face. He set the report down very carefully, the way she had set it down in the kitchen. He looked at the chamber entrance, at the cedar trees, at the collapsed section of old stone wall. He looked at Duke, who was lying in his usual position near the entrance with his chin on his paws. "Grandpa's dog," Ryan said. "Yes. He sat here for 11 days before you came. Yes." Ryan crouched and put his hand on Duke's side. The dog turned his head, looked at the young man with his cloudy amber eyes, and did not move. Ryan kept his hand there for a moment. "Good boy," he said quietly, not to anyone in particular. To the dog and to the morning and to whatever had arranged itself this way across 56 years of silence. Monday morning. She called Gerald Hutchins at 9 o'clock when she knew the bank had been open for an hour, and he would be settled at his desk with his coffee and his reading glasses and his lanyard. He answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Calloway." "Good morning." "Good morning, Gerald. I'm calling to discuss the liens." Careful pause. "Of course. I'd like to arrange full payoff. Both liens, the back property taxes, everything outstanding." The silence on his end lasted several seconds. She could hear faintly the sound of a pen being set down. "Full payoff," he said, as in the total balance on both notes, plus any accrued interest, plus the property tax arrears. "I want a payoff letter with the exact total, and I'd like to close this out within 30 days. Another silence. When he spoke again, the careful, measured quality was still there, but something underneath it had shifted. Something had surprised him. "Mrs. Calloway, that's approximately $96,000 with interest and fees. I know what it is." "May I ask?" "I'm not trying to pry. I just need to understand for documentation purposes. Has there been a change in your financial situation that I should be aware of?" He waited for more. She let him wait, not from cruelty, but because she was not ready to explain the whole of it to Gerald Hutchins before she had explained it to everyone else who mattered more. She would explain it eventually. The county would know soon enough. But she was not going to tell the story for the first time to a bank officer on a Monday morning. "All right," Gerald said, with the tone of a man who has decided that asking again would be inappropriate. "I'll have a payoff letter prepared by end of business today. You can pick it up tomorrow morning, or I can mail it." "I'll pick it up." She drove to the bank on Tuesday. Gerald Hutchins met her at his office door, which he had not done the other times she had been in. He shook her hand. He handed her the payoff letter with a formality that suggested he had been thinking since Monday about the appropriate way to receive someone who had arrived at his bank in October looking at foreclosure, and who was now arriving in May to close out a 6-figure debt in full. The number at the bottom of the payoff letter was $94,230. She looked at it for a moment. A number that had been the shape of her danger for 6 months. The number she had measured every other number against. The number that Gerald Hutchins and Dale and Roy Bassett and Frank Baxter had all used, in their different ways, to tell her the farm was beyond saving. She folded the letter, put it in her bag, and told Gerald she would be in touch with the wire transfer instructions within the week. He walked her to the lobby door. At the door, he stopped. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite his usual expression. Something more unguarded than his professional manner normally allowed. "Mrs. Calloway, for what it's worth, I'm glad it worked out." She looked at him. "It hasn't finished working out yet." He held the door. "No, I suppose it hasn't." Outside, she stood on the sidewalk for a moment before getting into the truck. The bank was on Main Street, 3 doors down from the hardware store where she had bought the pry bar and the flashlight and the gloves. Across the street, the woman who ran the pharmacy was unlocking her door for the morning. She glanced over and Midge nodded and the woman nodded back. An ordinary exchange. Town at 9 in the morning, doing what small towns do. By afternoon, the ordinary quality of the morning would be somewhat changed. Not because Midge said anything, she did not to anyone that day, but because Harlan County had always been a place where people paid attention to things that did not follow the expected pattern. And a woman who had been quietly failing on her father's farm since October, showing up at First National asking for a payoff letter on a 6-figure debt, was not the expected pattern. She knew the word would begin moving. She had planned for that. The only thing she had not planned for was how quickly it would find the people it was most interested in reaching. She had not planned to tell Roy Bassett. She had planned to let the bank records speak for themselves. Let the word reach him in the way that word reaches people in Harlan County. Through the invisible but efficient channels of a community that pays attention. But Roy showed up on a Wednesday evening 3 days after her bank visit, not with a casserole this time, just himself, driving up the farm lane in his truck and stopping near the barn. She was on the porch. She did not go to meet him. He climbed out, came partway up the walk, stopped. He looked at the left side of the porch, at the new post she had set, and the level line restored. He looked at the barn, at the yard, at the farm in the late evening light. Then he looked at her. "Heard something," he said. "People usually do. Heard you called the bank about paying off the debt." She said nothing. Roy took off his hat and held it in both hands, which was not his usual way. He was a man who kept his hat on as a general principle, the way certain men do, as much armor as headgear. Holding it in front of him like this exposed something in his face that she had not seen there before. "I also heard something about a find," he said, "back in your rock quarter." She still said nothing. He looked at his hat brim. "I told you back in November the rock quarter wasn't worth much." He paused. "I shouldn't have said that. I was talking about farming, about what you could grow back there. That was what I meant, but it wasn't." He stopped again. "I was telling you what I thought you could do with this farm. I was wrong about that, too." Was the closest thing to an apology Roy Bassett was constitutionally capable of producing, and she understood that. She had known him since she was 5 years old. He was not a flexible man, but he was an honest one in the way that counted. He would tell you what he saw, and when he had seen wrong, he would say so, even if the saying was stripped of most of its usual softness. "Come up on the porch," she said. He came up and sat in the chair beside hers, and they looked at the fields in the fading light, and she told him about duck and the depression in the ground and the limestone cap and the chamber, and what was in it. She told him about Warren Elston, the written assessment, and the payoff letter from the bank. She told him about Earl Calloway's inventory, the 40 years of entries in the compressed handwriting, and the last line at the bottom of the final page. Roy listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. When she finished, he sat for a while in silence, his hat on his knee. He looked out at the rock quarter, just visible in the distance as a darker shape at the field's edge. "Earl Calloway," he said at last. "The way people say the name of someone they thought they knew and are now reconsidering. I was about 20 years old when he died. I remember him." Remember him working stone, mostly. Never said much. No, he didn't. Never would have guessed. Turned the hat in his hands. A man can live right next to something his whole life and not know what's in it. She looked at him. That's true. He stood, put his hat back on, walked down the porch steps. At the bottom, he stopped without turning around. That fence line on the north boundary. The posts are starting to go on your side. I've got extra cedar posts in the barn. I'll bring them over Saturday if you want. I can pay for them. I know you can. He kept walking toward his truck. She watched him go. He did not look back, which was also his way. Roy Bassett did not perform his gestures. He simply made them. Dale called the same week. She had not told him. He had heard it the way people in the extended family heard things in the pre-internet world that Harlan County still largely operated on, through a chain of calls and mentions and second-hand accounts that traveled with the unreliable accuracy of that kind of transmission. He had heard that Midge had found something. He had heard it was money. His voice when she answered had the quality it always had when he was calculating. Not cold exactly. Assessing. I heard you found something on the property, he said. That's correct. Something significant, yes. A pause. Midge, if this is a family asset, if Daddy knew about it, or if it was something that was part of the estate. Dad didn't know about it, she said. It was Grandpa's. Built before Dad was old enough to know anything about it and never disclosed. It was part of the property it would be. I own the property, Dale. Her voice was even. Took the insurance money. Carol took the truck and the tractor and the savings. Dad left me the farm because I was the only one who wanted it. The farm was part of his estate. Everything on and under the farm was part of the farm. I own the farm. The silence on his end lasted long enough that she heard him shift his weight. I got a lawyer's letter ready, she said, if you want me to walk you through what I've had researched. Property law is not complicated here. Another silence. That's not? He stopped. I'm not. I know you're not going to fight it, Dale. You're practical. That's the right decision. He hung up before she had finished the sentence. She held the phone for a moment, then set it in the cradle. Duke was sitting in the kitchen doorway watching her. She looked at him. That's done, she told him. What was not done was the question of what to do with the collection. That was the question she had been pushing to the back of her mind during the weeks of documentation and appraisal and bank calls and family conversations, because it was the question that required the most from her. Not practically, but in terms of what she believed. Earl had built the chamber for the farm, for James, for whoever came after. He had not specified what came next. He had not left but instructions for what Midge should do with what he had accumulated. That had been his way. He had provided the resource and trusted the future to use it correctly. Whether that trust was wisdom or faith or simply the only option available to a man who could not see what the future looked like, she could not say. Probably some of all three. She knew what she was not going to do. She was not going to sell the farm. Not the house, not the bottom ground, not the rock quarter, not any of it. The debt was going to be cleared. The equipment was going to be replaced with what was necessary and reliable. The barn roof was going to be repaired properly, not patched. The left side of the porch was already level. These were fixed. Beyond those fixed things, she had been thinking about Amber. Amber, who had come to Harlan without complaint and enrolled in a strange school and done her homework at that kitchen table every night and handled every difficulty she encountered with a seriousness that was going to serve her well in the world if the world would let it. Amber, who had said, "This is ours," at the entrance of an underground chamber before she had any idea what it was worth, because she had already understood what it meant. That girl was going to college. That was not going to be a question of money anymore. Ryan, who had stood in the rock quarter and crouched beside Duke and said, "Good boy," in the direction of a 10-year-old hound and a 56-year-old secret, and a grandfather he had never met, and who had not asked what the collection was worth until she showed him the written assessment. That restraint was something, the kind of something you want to reward. She had also been thinking about the county, not abstractly, specifically. There was a school in the south end of the county that had been operating without adequate equipment for 3 years, which she knew because Amber had mentioned it in November, and Midge had filed it away in the part of her mind that files things away. There was a volunteer fire department 6 miles east that had been fundraising for a truck for 2 years without reaching its goal. These were not grand gestures she was planning. They were specific ones. The kind that came from knowing a place rather than performing generosity toward it. Whether any of this matched what Earl had intended, she could not know. For James, for whoever comes after, the sentence left a great deal to interpretation. She chose to interpret it as permission. What she was going to do beyond the fixed things was a question she sat with in the evenings after Amber went to bed, with Earl's inventory on the table beside her, with Duke asleep at her feet. Not every question needed to be answered before you started moving. She had learned by October that sometimes the right approach was to make the first decision clearly, and let the rest emerge from that. The first decision was already made. She was keeping the farm. The rest would follow from that the way everything had followed from it. One thing at a time, in the right order, with the patience of someone who had learned it from a man who built something worth finding and trusted the earth to hold it. Earth had held it for 56 years. She could afford to be patient. There was a morning in early June, 6 weeks after Warren Elst's assessment arrived, and 3 weeks after the bank received the first wire transfer, when the weight of it finally settled. Not the weight of debt or uncertainty, which had been lifting gradually since April, the weight of understanding. The particular gravity that comes when something you have been living inside starts to become visible to you as the thing it actually is. Amber had left for school. Ryan had driven back to Louisville the Sunday before. Roy Bassett had brought the cedar fence posts on Saturday as promised, and they had set 6 of them together without discussing anything beyond the fence. Gerald Hutchins had sent a letter confirming receipt of the first payment. Warren Elst had submitted the 3 flagged coins for grading. Farm was quiet in the way that June mornings are quiet in eastern Kentucky. Birdsong and the creek and the wind in the ridge trees, the sounds that have been there for long enough that they have stopped being sounds and become the baseline of silence itself. Midge walked out to the rock quarter alone. Duke came with her, his tags jingling, moving more slowly than he had in the fall, but still steady, still purposeful. They went to the chamber entrance. She had installed a proper wooden door over the opening by then, hinged and lockable, with weather stripping to keep the moisture out. Chamber itself had not been emptied yet. Warren had recommended leaving everything in situ until the formal sale process was arranged, which would take time and needed to be done correctly. She unlocked the door and looked inside. The flashlight beam lit the interior the same way it always had. Crates, the cylinders, the metal boxes, the shelves, the swept floor. The ceiling her grandfather had built to last. She thought about the 11 days Duke had sat in this spot before she paid attention. She thought about what would have happened if she had not paid attention. The dog had simply been another thing she did not have time for in the press of debt and February cold and practical decisions. She had assumed, the way reasonable people assume, that an old dog sitting in a field was an old dog sitting in a field. She crouched at the entrance for a while, not going in, just looking. Behind her, Duke settled onto the ground. She heard him exhale the long, slow breath she had heard on his first night in her bedroom, the bottomless breath of a dog that has finished something and is ready to rest. She turned and looked at him. He was looking back at her with his cloudy amber eyes and the expression that old dogs carry, the one that contains everything they know and none of the words for it. "Good boy," she said. He closed his eyes. She locked the chamber door, stood up, looked out over the rock quarter, over the cedar trees, and the collapsed stone wall, and the 40 acres that nobody had farmed. The morning light was coming up over the east ridge now, yellow and warm, falling across the field the way her grandfather would have seen it fall from this same piece of ground, standing here with the same ridge behind him and the same creek below and the same silence that eastern Kentucky produces when it is not being interrupted. She was going to be all right. She had known that for a while now, in the practical sense. The debt was clearing, the appraisal was documented, the collection was secure. This was different. This was the knowledge settling into the place where it would live from now on, not in her head, but somewhere below that, somewhere permanent. She stood at the chamber door for a moment longer. She thought about her father, who had farmed this land for 42 years after Earl died, and had never once walked into that corner with a shovel. She had asked herself, in the weeks since the discovery, whether it troubled her that James had not known, whether she wished he had been the one to find it, had been the one to clear the debt and repair the barn, and see the farm for what it could be, rather than what it was failing to be, did not trouble her. She had thought about it long enough to know that. Her father had gotten something different from the farm. He had gotten the daily weight of it, the dailiness of it, the unremarkable but absolute quality of a life spent doing the same necessary work in the same place through all the weather the Kentucky ridges could produce. That was not a lesser thing. That was its own complete thing, and Earl's chamber had not been part of it, because Earl had made it something separate, something held in reserve for a moment the farm might actually need it. October to May. 7 months from her first morning on the sagging porch to this morning at the chamber door. The distance between those 2 mornings was not large in calendar terms, but in every other way it was as far as she had ever traveled. She locked the chamber door, stood up, looked out over the rock quarter, over the cedar trees and the collapsed stone wall and the 40 acres that nobody had farmed. Shh! The morning light was coming up over the east ridge now, yellow and warm, falling across the field the way her grandfather would have seen it fall from this same piece of ground on, standing here with the same ridge behind him and the same creek below and the same sun silence that eastern Kentucky produces when it is not being interrupted. She walked back to the house. There was work to do. The grading results came back on the 3 flagged coins in the 3rd week of June. Warren called on a Tuesday morning, and the precision in his voice was different from his usual precision, tighter, more deliberate. The way a careful person sounds when they are choosing each word to make sure it lands exactly right. 3 double eagles had been examined and graded by the professional coin grading service. 2 of them were confirmed as 1920s San Francisco Mint strikes, graded MS-62, a Mint State grade that placed them in the upper range of circulated survivors for that issue. 3rd was the one that had kept Warren quiet on the telephone for a beat longer than the others. 3rd coin, he said, is a 1927D Denver Mint double eagle. Midge was at the kitchen table. She had a cup of coffee that was still hot, which she would not get around to finishing. "I don't know what that means," she said. "Tell me what that means," Warren told her. The 1927D Denver Mint St. Gaudens Double Eagle was one of the scarcest gold coins in American numismatic history. The Denver Mint had struck, fewer than 200,000 of them before the entire mintage was melted under the government's gold recall order in 1933. The number believed to have survived that melting was somewhere between 10 and 15 specimens, all of them in mint state condition. Because none of them had ever entered general circulation before the order came. For a coin from that issue to exist in the condition that Warren was describing, graded MS-64 by the Professional Coin Grading Service, a grade suggesting a piece that had been handled with extraordinary care since the moment it left the mint, meant that what Earl Calloway had acquired at some point before 1933, possibly without fully understanding what he had, was not simply a gold coin worth its weight and its scarcity, was something beyond that. Warren gave her a current auction estimate. She wrote it down on the legal pad beside the coffee. Her handwriting was steady. Her hand was not. When you're ready to discuss the full sale, Warren said, I'd recommend a major numismatic auction house. Heritage Auctions in Dallas handles high-value American coins regularly. So does Stack's Bowers in New York. For a piece like the 1927 D, you'll want maximum bidder visibility. Is a coin that serious collectors and institutional buyers will travel for. She asked how long the process would take. He estimated 6 to 8 months from submission to auction if she moved promptly. The authentication was already done. Cataloging was complete. Collection's provenance. The inventory Earl had kept, the chamber documentation Warren had photographed and recorded, would actually strengthen the appeal of certain pieces to buyers who valued documented history. She thanked him and set the phone down, and sat for a moment looking at what she had written on the legal pad. The 1927 D alone, at the estimate Warren had given her, represented more money than the entire original assessment. Added to the rest of the collection, the total that had seemed large in May now seemed like a floor rather than a ceiling. She picked up the legal pad and looked at the numbers again. Then she set it down and drank the cold coffee, and thought about a man born in 1895 on this farm who had once picked up a coin, possibly at a bank exchange, possibly through a private transaction, possibly in circumstances she would never know, and placed it in a cloth roll and carried it to a chamber he had built with his own hands under 4 feet of limestone and written it down in his inventory in the same compressed, careful script as everything else. He had not known what he had. She was certain of that. Earl Calloway had been accumulating gold coins the way certain men of his generation accumulated things they believed would hold value when paper would not. He had not been a numismatist. He had not known the difference between a common Liberty Head double eagle and a 1927 D Denver Mint Strike, had not known that one was worth roughly the price of a good tractor, and the other was worth the price of the farm itself many times over. He had known only that gold was something the world could not make worthless overnight, and he had believed in it with the specific faith of a man who had watched the world try to make everything else worthless and partially succeed. He had been right about gold. He had also stumbled, once, onto something that went past being right, onto something rare enough to be in a different category entirely. Midge sat at the kitchen table in the house where Earl had been born, where her father had grown up, where she had grown up too, and felt the full weight of what had been sitting under 40 acres of unfarmed ground for 60 years, waiting for a Bluetick hound to notice it. She did not tell anyone the number from the grading results. Not Amber, not Ryan, not Roy Bassett. She told Warren to proceed with the heritage auction submission, and she filed his paperwork, and she went back to work on the farm. The barn roof was the next project. She hired a roofing crew from Harlan, 2 men who had worked in the county for 20 years, and she paid them in full from the first tranche of funds she had set aside from the sale, proceeds already in motion. The men worked for 4 days. When they finished, the barn had a new metal roof that would outlast her. She stood in the yard, looking up at it the evening after they left, and felt the specific satisfaction of something repaired rather than merely maintained. The equipment situation took longer. She spent 2 weeks in July talking to implement dealers in Harlan and Corbin, and once driving to Lexington, comparing what the farm needed against what the market offered. She was not extravagant. That was not in her nature, and it was not in Earl's inventory either. His entries recorded sensible quantities in sensible denominations, the behavior of a man who understood the difference between protecting value and performing wealth. She bought what the farm actually needed: a reliable tractor to replace the one Carol had taken, serviceable and well-maintained rather than new, a newer hay baler, parts for the irrigation system in the east field that had been limping along on a workaround for 2 years. Roy Bassett helped her evaluate the tractor. He showed up for that without being asked, which was the same as asking, which was as close as Roy Bassett came to offering things directly. He knew tractors the way he knew fence posts, with the accumulated knowledge of a lifetime of necessary familiarity. He walked around the 2 she was considering, checked the hours, looked at the hydraulics, made a sound with his teeth that she had learned meant he was thinking. "The blue one," he said finally, pointing at a 6-year-old machine with a clean service history. "The dealer wants $8,000 more for it. Worth it." He looked at her steadily. "If you're going to be here for the long run, you want the blue one. If you're going to be here for the long run." She held that for a moment. Roy Bassett was not a man who said things he did not mean. He had been saying this farm was beyond saving in November, and he was saying now, in the particular language of equipment evaluation and fence posts delivered unbidden, that he had revised that opinion entirely. She bought the blue tractor. The auction was scheduled for the 3rd Saturday in October in Dallas. Warren had submitted the collection to Heritage Auctions in July, and in the months between, the catalog had been prepared. A full written history of the Calloway collection, as it had come to be officially titled, with Warren's authentication notes and Earl's original inventory reproduced in full, and the provenance of each major piece documented as carefully as the evidence allowed. The 1927 D was the centerpiece. The catalog listing for it alone ran 4 pages. She drove down with Ryan and Amber. It was the first time the 3 of them had been in a car together without it being for a funeral or a family obligation, and the drive felt different for that. Easier. More like something they were choosing rather than something they were doing because it was required. Ryan drove. Amber sat in the back and read for the first 8 hours. At dinner somewhere in Tennessee, she put the book down and looked out the window at the dark highway. "Are you nervous?" she asked, not to either of them specifically. "No," Midge said. "I am," Ryan said. "Why are you nervous?" Amber asked him. "Because it's a lot of money. And something can always go wrong with a lot of money." Midge looked at the road ahead. "If it went wrong tomorrow," she said, "we still cleared the debt. Still have the farm. We'd be worse off than the estimate, but we wouldn't be back where we started." Ryan thought about this. That's a good way to look at it. It's the only sensible way to look at it. Amber went back to her book. Ryan drove. The highway unreeled ahead of them through the Tennessee dark. The auction house was on a broad commercial street in Dallas, a building that managed to look both ordinary from the outside and extraordinary inside, the way places that deal in genuinely valuable things often do. Understated at the door, precise and careful within. Heritage Auctions had been conducting major numismatic sales for decades. The room they were shown into for the preview session held collectors and dealers from across the country, a room full of the specific attentiveness that people bring to things they care about. Warren was already there. He shook Midge's hand and walked her to the display case where the Calloway collection was arranged across two glass shelves, the gold coins in their graded slabs, their surfaces catching the case lighting, the Morgan dollars in their holders, two 1920s coins, and in its own case in the center of the lower shelf, the 1927D. She looked at the coin. It was smaller than she had expected. She had known the dimensions, she had looked them up, but seeing it in person was different. It was a $20 gold piece, roughly the size of a 50-cent coin, double the thickness. One side showed an eagle in flight, wings spread against a rising sun. The other showed liberty striding forward, a torch in one hand, an olive branch in the other. The relief was sharp and undamaged. The surface had the quality of something that had been kept from the world long enough that the world had not had the chance to wear it down. Earl had put it in a cloth roll in a wooden crate in a limestone chamber in 1933 or before, and there it had stayed for 60 years, untouched, unknown, as perfect as the day it left the Denver Mint, while everything it had been made to represent, and everything that had surrounded it in 1933, had shifted and changed and become unrecognizable. She looked at it for a long time. Warren stood beside her. "You all right?" "I'm fine." She meant it. "I'm just looking at what my grandfather thought was a $20 coin." Warren allowed himself a small, dry sound that was not quite a laugh. He was right. It was a $20 coin, worth considerably more than $20 now. Considerably. She stepped back from the case and let the dealers and collectors take their turn. The auction lasted most of the day. Midge sat in the third row with Ryan on her left and Amber on her right, and she watched the room with the same focused attention she had brought to Earl's inventory pages. Systematically, completely, noting what was there without performing emotion about it. Atmosphere in the room was not the dramatic tension that auction scenes in films suggest. It was quieter than that, more professional. The energy of people who do this regularly and know that the best bid wins and that there is no use in theater. She looked around the room between lots. Collectors who had driven or flown in from other states, some of them carrying the particular stillness of men who have waited a long time for a specific thing to come available and have finally seen it arrive. Dealers in suits who would buy and resell. Few people she could not categorize, sitting in the back rows with the attentiveness of people who are not bidding but want to see what happens. Somewhere among all of them, she thought, there might be someone who would bring the 1927D home to a collection that understood what it was. She did not need to know who that person was. She only needed to know that the coin was going to the right hands through the right process, that Earl's 40 years of patience would be honored by an outcome conducted with equal seriousness. The Morgan dollars sold in lots, the better graded pieces in individual lots, and the common date coins in larger groupings. The totals accumulated in a pace that felt almost methodical, not because the numbers were small, but because Warren had prepared her well, and the bids were tracking the estimates closely. Then the 1927D came up. The auctioneer introduced it with a description that was exactly the length of a description that does not need to oversell what it is presenting, which is to say brief and precise. There was a brief silence before the opening bid came in. Not dramatic silence, the silence of a room that is paying attention. Midge kept her hands folded in her lap. Ryan had gone completely still beside her. Amber watched with the serious, observant look she brought to things she wanted to understand completely. Bidding started at the estimate floor Warren had given her, It moved past that within 30 seconds, kept moving. Bidders she could not see on the telephone lines were active. A man in a suit in the front row raised his paddle twice and then stopped. The telephone bids continued. Auctioneer's voice maintained its professional cadence throughout, neither hurrying nor performing enthusiasm, simply tracking what was happening. The hammer came down. The final bid for the 1927D Denver Mint St. Gaudens Double Eagle MS-64 was 3 times Warren's original estimate from the assessment report, and 4 times what she had written on the legal pad the morning he called about the grading results. The room absorbed this number the way rooms do when a result exceeds the range of expected outcomes, not with noise, but with a brief altered quality of attention, as though everyone present was quietly recalibrating. Ryan made a sound beside her, a short breath. She reached over and put her hand on his arm. "Don't," she said quietly. He nodded. He understood. He was her son. Final tally from the full auction, including all lots, was $2,312,000 before Heritage's commission. After commission and fees, the net to Midge was $2,068,000. Added to the debt she had already cleared, and the operating funds already spent on the barn, and the equipment, the net from the auction, still left her with approximately $1,940,000 in hand. She sat in the hotel room that evening with Ryan and Amber eating sandwiches from a place 3 blocks away because none of them had wanted to go to a restaurant and be in public with what they were carrying. Ryan had the numbers on a piece of paper. He had written them down during the auction and calculated the totals correctly and then checked them twice. "Mom," he said, looking at the paper, "I know. This is—" He stopped. "I know." Amber was sitting cross-legged on the bed, eating her sandwich with the same composed attention she brought to everything. She looked at her mother and her brother and said, without drama, "Grandpa Earl never did anything loud in his whole life, and look at what he did." Midge looked at her daughter. "No," she said, "he never did anything loud." She thought about the compressed handwriting, the 40 years of entries. The final line, "He just did it right." She drove back to Harlan County on Monday. She stopped at the farm lane and looked down it at the house before she turned in, a habit she had developed without noticing, the habit of seeing the farm as it was before she was absorbed back into the dailiness of it. The new barn roof caught the October light. The yard was clear, the porch was level. The cedar trees of the rock quarter were visible in the distance, moving in a wind that had gone cold overnight. Duke was on the porch when she pulled up. He raised his head. His tail moved once, slowly. She brought her bag inside, changed out of her driving clothes, came back out and sat on the porch beside him, put his head in her lap. She put her hand on his side and felt his breathing, steady, slower than it had been in the spring, the deliberate respiration of a dog who has earned the right to a slower pace. He was 10 years old. Bluetick hounds lived on average to 11 or 12. She had known for some months that the fall would be different from the spring, but she had not wanted to measure it. She sat with him until the light faded and the temperature dropped enough that she needed to go in. County learned the full story in November, when a reporter from the Harlan Daily Enterprise called asking if she would speak for a piece about the collection. She had known the story was coming. Word in Harlan County moved on its own timeline, but it always moved, and she had decided in the weeks before the auction that she was not going to resist it. The story was real. It had happened on land that her family had owned for 4 generations. It was not embarrassing to her, and it would not be reduced by being known. She spoke to the reporter for an hour on the phone. She was specific and accurate. She described what Duke had done, what she had found, what Warren Elst had assessed, what the auction had produced. She described Earl Calloway's inventory and the final line in his handwriting. She described the 1927D coin and what it had been worth and what it had meant that it was sitting in a wooden crate in a limestone chamber under the rock quarter for 6 decades. She also described the debt and the bank and the 9-month clock, not to generate sympathy. She did not want sympathy, had not wanted it in October, and did not want it now, but because the story was incomplete without it. The chamber and what was in it meant something different if you knew what it had been found against. The coin was worth a great deal because of what it was. It had mattered the way it mattered because of when it was found, and by whom, and what was at stake. Peace ran the following week, was 2 pages inside the paper, and was picked up by the Lexington Herald Leader, which ran an abbreviated version 3 days later. That version was picked up by the Associated Press wire, and from there it went in directions she had not anticipated and could not fully track. Calls came in from numbers she did not recognize, and she did not answer most of them. Letters arrived in the mailbox, more of them than she expected, from people she did not know across the country who had read the story in one form or another and wanted to tell her something. She read every letter. She did not answer most of them, but she read them because they were people who had taken time to write, and that was not nothing. Most of them were about their own families, about grandparents who had done something like what Earl had done, or something smaller, or something that had ultimately not worked out the way this had, about the Depression and what it had done to the generation that lived through it, and what that generation had passed on in the forms it could manage, about land and what it meant to hold it and what it cost to lose it. One letter came from a woman in western Kentucky who said her grandmother had hidden Liberty Head silver dollars in a coffee tin under the kitchen floor of a house that had since been torn down, and she had always wondered whether the new house was built over them. One came from a retired farmer in Nebraska who said his father had done something similar with silver plate in the 1940s and had told him about it on his deathbed, but had not specified where, and the farm had been sold in 1987. One came from a man in Ohio who said he had read the story about the dog 3 times and cried all 3 times, which he could not fully explain. She understood it. The story was not really about the money, which was what the AP wire had made it seem and what people would remember it as. The farming widow, the Bluetick Hound, the buried gold, the Depression-era coin. Those facts were accurate. But the thing the letters were responding to was the other part, the part about waiting, about a dog that sat in one spot for 11 days, about a woman who finally came. She saved them in a box in the kitchen cabinet. Frank called on a Tuesday evening, 2 weeks after the story ran in the Lexington paper. His voice had the measured quality she had known for 12 years, but there was something else in it. Something slightly outside his usual register, as though he had rehearsed the call and found on arrival that his rehearsal had not fully accounted for what he wanted to say. "I read about it," he said. "I figured you would. Are you? Is everything?" He paused. "I'm glad it worked out, Midge." She recognized this as genuine. Frank was not a man who said things he did not mean. He was also not a man who easily said things that cost him something, and this call was costing him something because it required him to acknowledge to her directly that his assessment of the situation in November had been wrong. Not wrong as a financial projection. The debt had been real, and the risk had been real, and his projections had followed from the available evidence. Wrong in the more fundamental way, the way she had known he was wrong from the first day she had sat on the sagging porch and listened to the farm breathe. wrong about what the farm was and what she was capable of and what the ground under a person's feet might sometimes hold. "Thank you," she said. "Ryan called me." A pause. He's proud of you. He's a good boy. He is." Frank was quiet for a moment. "Is Amber doing all right?" "Down there, I mean, in the school. Amber is doing better than all right. She always does." He said it with the kind of certainty that parents have about their children even after the parents have stopped being in the same house. "Are you going to apply to college?" "Yes." "Good. That's good." He did not ask about money. He understood from the article that money was no longer the shape of the question. "Well, I just wanted to call." "I know. Thank you, Frank." She hung up and sat with it for a moment. Not with triumph or satisfaction. She did not feel either of those things in relation to Frank, not after 7 years. What she felt was something milder and more final. The particular closure that comes when a person who was wrong about you acknowledges it, not grandly or publicly, but privately and quietly, in the only form they are capable of, was enough. It had always been enough. She had never needed more than that from Frank, or from Dale, or from Roy Sitt, or from any of the others. She had needed the farm. She had needed the time to work it. She had needed a 10-year-old hound who refused to leave a spot in the rock quarter until someone paid attention. She had gotten all of those things. The school in the south end of the county was called Hogg Elementary, which had given generations of children the opportunity to develop a particular relationship with the comedy of institutional naming. Served 312 students in kindergarten through 6th grade. Principal was a woman named Dolores Hatcher, 47 years old, who had been principal for 9 years and who had been writing grant applications for updated science equipment for 4 of those 9 years with limited success. Midge called Dolores Hatcher in November, a week after the newspaper story ran. She explained that she wanted to make a contribution to the school's equipment fund. She had a specific number in mind, $60,000, which was what Warren's original estimate had allocated as the potential additional value from the flagged coins, and which she had decided, when the actual auction result far exceeded that, was the right amount for this purpose. Not because the math had to work out that way, because $60,000 would cover the science equipment and the computer lab upgrade and a new gymnasium floor, and she had looked those numbers up before she called. Dolores Hatcher was quiet on the phone for a moment. Then she said, "Mrs. Calloway, can I ask why the school?" Midge thought about it. "'Cause Amber told me in November that the science room didn't have enough microscopes," she said. "Because I think Earl Calloway would have considered it a reasonable use of something that came from the ground." Dolores thanked her at some length. Midge listened, accepted the thanks without deflecting them, and ended the call. The volunteer fire department in the east end of the county had been trying to fund a replacement engine for 2 years. The fundraising total, she had looked up, was $41,000 against a needed $83,000. She covered the difference. She did not attend the ceremony when the truck arrived, though she was invited. Amber went in her place, which was the right decision. Amber represented the farm better than Midge did in public situations, having her father's ease with people and her mother's seriousness about what mattered. These were not large gestures in the context of what the collection had produced. She knew that. She was not performing generosity. She was being specific about what the county needed and what she had the ability to provide, and she was doing it without announcement, the way Earl had built things. Quietly, with the understanding that what you build is demonstrated by its existence and not by your description of it. December arrived cold and early, the first hard freeze coming in the second week and staying. Midge covered the farm's water lines and moved the equipment she had bought into the barn and prepared for winter with the accumulated instinct of someone who had grown up watching a farmer prepare for winter. The motions were familiar. The meaning was different from the year before. Duke moved more slowly in the cold. He came out with her in the mornings, but stopped staying out as long as he had in the warmer months, turning back toward the house after an hour, making his way to the porch and settling into the heavy sleep of an old dog in December. She bought him a better bed, a thick orthopedic pad that the vet had recommended when she brought him in for a checkup in November. Bet, a quiet man named Doctor Sargent, who had practiced in Harlan County for 30 years, had looked Duke over with the careful attention of someone who had seen many old dogs and knew exactly what he was seeing. "He's doing well for his age," Dr. Sargent said. "Heart's strong. Some arthritis in the back legs, which is normal. Keep him warm and let him set his own pace." "How long?" Dr. Sargent looked at her over the dog's back, not unkindly, the same way he probably looked at the owners of every old animal who asked the same question. "Hard to say. Could be another year, could be less. You'll know when it's time." She brought Duke home and fed him his dinner and sat on the floor beside his new bed until he was asleep. The farm was quiet through January and February. She used the time to do the work that winter permits, planning the spring planting schedule, repairing equipment in the barn, going through the maintenance book her father had kept and updating it with what had been done and what still needed doing. She started a second book alongside it, a record of her own that she wrote in the same matter-of-fact way her father had written his, noting dates and weather and observations about the land. Amber applied to 3 colleges in January: University of Kentucky, Berea College, the University of Louisville. Her grades were good. Her essay was something she had worked on for 2 months without asking for help. And Midge had read it once when Amber left it on the kitchen table and then put it back without saying anything because there was nothing to add to what her daughter had written. Essay was about watching her mother repair a fence, about what it looked like from the outside when someone chose to keep going at something, about a dog sitting in a field. 3 acceptance letters arrived before March. Amber chose Berea because Berea's model, free tuition for all students in exchange for campus work, appealed to her in a way she explained to her mother one evening as, "It means something to earn it." Midge did not argue with this, though the money was available and the choice meant 4 years of work study on top of coursework. Amber was 16 years old, and she had already demonstrated in Harlan County in a difficult year that she understood the relationship between earning and meaning in a way that most people took much longer to arrive at. The college fund Midge had established was there regardless. Whatever Amber did not spend at Berea would be waiting. Duke died on a Wednesday morning in March, the week after Amber's acceptance letters arrived. Been slower for several weeks. Not dramatically, not the visible collapse that sometimes announces these endings, but the incremental slowing of a body that has decided it has done what it came to do. Stopped going to the rock quarter in February, which she had noted and understood without saying. He stopped going further than the yard by the end of February. The first week of March, he stopped going off the porch except to relieve himself. On Tuesday evening, she sat on the porch floor with him for a long time, her back against the clapboard siding, his head in her lap. The March air was cold but not bitter, the particular cold of late winter that carries in it the promise of something else coming. She could hear the creek in the hollow. She could hear the cedar trees. She did not talk to him. She had never been a person who talked to animals the way some people do, as though the conversation were an end in itself. She just sat with him and put her hand on his side and felt his breathing and let the evening pass. He was there in the morning, on his bed inside the kitchen door where she had moved him in January. He looked at her when she came downstairs. His tail moved once. She crouched beside him and put her hand on his side again. His breathing was shallow and even. She called Dr. Sargent at 7:30. He arrived at 9. He examined Duke with the same careful, unhurried attention he brought to everything, and when he was done, he looked at Midge across the dog's gray muzzle. "He's not in distress," Dr. Sargent said. "His body is slowing on its own. It won't be long." She thanked him, and he left, and she sat on the kitchen floor beside Duke's bed for the rest of the morning. She had rescheduled what she had planned to do that day. This was the plan now. Ryan called at noon. He had known somehow. The way he had always known when something was coming. And he asked if she needed him to come down. She said not yet, but she would call. He said all right, he was there, and she thanked him and hung up. Duke died at 2 in the afternoon, quietly, without distress. She had her hand on his side. She felt his breathing slow, and then pause and then stop. Outside the kitchen window, the March light was thin and clear on the fields. The cedar trees moved in the distance. She sat with him for a while after that. She was not a person who cried easily or often, but she cried then, not for long, not with noise, but genuinely the way you cry when something that has been with you through the worst and the best of a particular period of your life reaches its end, and the weight of the whole period falls on you at once. She thought about October, about standing on the back porch with cold coffee, watching a dog refuse to move from a spot in the rock quarter, not understanding what she was seeing, filing it as probably hunting. About the morning, she finally walked out with him and sat on the limestone slab and looked at the oval depression and felt something stir in her memory that had no name yet. About the 12 days he had waited before she came. She thought about the chamber, about the color of old gold in flashlight, about her grandfather's handwriting running in compressed, careful rows across aging paper, recording 40 years of quiet work. About a final line that had been sitting in a sealed metal box in a limestone chamber since 1967, waiting to be read by whoever came after. She had come after. She buried Duke at the edge of the rock quarter, near the old stone wall, in ground her grandfather's hands had worked, and her own hands had worked, and that would be worked by whoever came after her in turn. Took her most of the afternoon to dig the grave, because the ground was still February hard, and she had to work at it, which was fine. Some things should take effort. Ryan came on Thursday as she had asked. He helped her carry Duke out in the morning, and he worked alongside her without speaking much, which was the way she needed it. Worked together the way they had worked together in August, with the ease of two people who know each other well enough to share labor, without it requiring management. When it was done, Ryan stood for a moment with his hands at his sides and looked at the ground and said nothing. She put her hand briefly on his shoulder. She tamped the earth down when she was done and stood over it in the late afternoon light. No marker yet. She would have one cut eventually, limestone, local stone, the same material Earl had used for everything he had built here. But not today. Today she just stood. Behind her, the cedar trees moved in the wind. Ahead of her, the rock quarter opened across its 40 acres of rough ground, the limestone shelf still visible where she had not yet fully refilled the excavation around the chamber. The chamber itself stood sealed behind its wooden door, the collection gone now to heritage auctions, and from there to collectors and institutions across the country, but the chamber itself remaining. She had decided to keep it. Warren had suggested it might have some historical documentation value. A Depression-era private storage chamber in original condition was not something that came up often. She had not made any decisions about it yet. She would decide in time. She walked back to the house. The porch was level. The barn roof was new. The equipment shed held a reliable tractor and a functioning baler. The fields were ready for spring planting. The debt was gone. The county had a fire truck, and 312 children had microscopes. She went inside, washed her hands, started the kettle. Amber would be home from school in an hour. Ryan was driving down Friday for the weekend. The farm needed to be walked on Saturday. The irrigation line in the north field had been making a sound she did not trust, and she wanted to check it before it became an emergency rather than after. She sat at the kitchen table while the kettle came to heat. Earl's inventory volumes were still in the cabinet by the stove where she had put them after Warren finished with them. She opened the first volume to the last page and looked at the final entry again, the one she had read more times than she could count. September 2, 1967, for the farm, for James, for whoever comes after. She had thought many times about what those words meant to Earl when he wrote them, whether they were written with the sense that he was near the end, or simply with the practical awareness that the end would come eventually, as it comes for everyone, and that the chamber needed its note the same way a letter needed its closing. She had not resolved this. She did not think she ever would. But she had resolved what the words meant to her. They meant that a man she had known only briefly, in the last years of his life when she was too young to ask him anything important, had built something that outlasted him by 6 decades and had arrived in her hands at precisely the moment it was needed. That the care he had put into the chamber, the dressed limestone, the patient mortar, the iron pins in their channels, the inventory kept with the seriousness of someone that records are a form of respect for the future, had been preserved because he had built it correctly, and had been found because a dog had refused to leave a spot in the ground. She was not a person given to statements about fate or providence. She did not know how to account for the chain of events that had led from Earl Calloway standing in the rock quarter with a trowel in 1930 to Duke sitting in the same spot in April 80 some years later. She did not need to account for it. What had happened, and what it required of her was not an explanation but a response. She had responded by keeping the farm. Everything else had followed from that. The spring planting went well. The irrigation line turned out to be a loose fitting rather than the crack she had feared, fixed in an afternoon. The hay came in ahead of schedule in July, the best yield the farm had seen in the 12 years since her father's equipment had started failing him. Roy Bassett came over to look at the new baler and stayed for coffee and told her, in the roundabout way he told things, that her father would have been pleased about the hay yield. She said she thought so too. Ryan came down for a week in August and worked the farm alongside her the way he had worked it as a boy, when James was still alive and the summer visits had been about learning a place rather than measuring its debts. He had grown into the work the way she had grown into it, not without effort, but with the willingness that makes effort productive. On the last evening before he drove back to Louisville, they sat on the porch after dark, and he asked her what she was going to do with the chamber. She had been thinking about it. Warren had connected her with a historian at the University of Kentucky who had expressed interest in documenting it as an example of Depression-era private wealth preservation practices. The physical structure, the inventory system, the unusual completeness of the record Earl had kept. Nothing invasive, documentation only. She had said she would consider it. "I think I want people to be able to know about it," she told Ryan, "not to see it necessarily, just to know it existed, what it was, what he did." Ryan looked out at the dark. He did a lot. He did, and he never told anyone. "Why do you think he never told Grandpa?" She had thought about this often. She had a few answers, none of them complete. I think he believed that telling someone changed what the thing was, she said. It shifted the weight of it from the ground to the person you told, and then that person was carrying it instead of the ground. The ground was better at carrying things long term. Ryan was quiet for a moment. That's a lot to ask of someone. To build something for people who don't know it's there. Yes, not everyone could do that. He looked out at the fields, at the dark shape of the cedar trees at the rock quarter's edge. No, she said. Not everyone could. Amber left for Berea in late August. Drive took 4 hours through the green hills of central Kentucky. Ryan came for it, and the three of them made the trip together. Amber sat in the back with a book for the first 2 hours and then gave it up and watched the hills go by, which was unusual enough that Midge noted it without mentioning it. She was allowing herself to feel the drive, to let it register as the thing it was rather than moving through it with her habitual composure. Midge watched her in the rearview mirror and let her have it. Amber's room in the dormitory was small and clean and impersonal in the way of dormitory rooms, and they spent 2 hours making it less impersonal, arranging the things she had brought, finding where things fit in the small space. Ryan built the bookshelf she had packed in pieces in the back of the truck. Midge made the bed. Amber arranged her books on the new shelf and stood back and looked at them with someone who has just made a space into something that belongs to them. At the door, leaving, Amber hugged her mother for a long time and said into her shoulder, "Thank you for staying." Midge held her daughter. "You're the one who stayed with me." "I know. That's why I'm thanking you." She drove back to the farm alone. Ryan had taken a different route home. The hills were still green, the summer not yet fully released to fall. She turned down the farm lane and looked at the house before she turned in. The habit she had kept since October, the habit of seeing the place before she was absorbed back into it. Porch was level. The barn roof caught the late afternoon light on its new metal slope. The yard was clear. The cedar trees of the rock quarter moved at the edge of the field. It was quiet, the way the farm had always been quiet, the particular quiet of a place that has been worked and cared for and is ready for the next thing. She sat in the truck for a moment before going in. She thought about Duke. About the morning she had stood on the porch with cold coffee and called his name, and he had turned and looked at her and turned back. About the 11 days and the morning she had finally walked out. About what would have happened if she had kept assuming, if she had never gone. She did not know what Duke had sensed in that ground. She did not know whether it was the faint mineral trace of oxidizing metal carried up through soil over decades, or something else, something older and less explicable that belongs to animals in ways humans do not have the right instruments to measure. She was not going to claim to know. What she knew was that he had refused to leave until she came, that whatever he had found, he had waited for her to find it too, and that this was in some form she could not quite articulate, but could not quite abandon either, the most important thing that had happened in her life in at least the last 20 years. Grief for him was real. She had not expected it to be so direct and physical. The morning she came downstairs and he was not at the kitchen door was an absence she felt in her chest rather than simply registered in her mind. She had not owned a dog as an adult. She had thought of Duke for the first months after October as her father's dog still, a responsibility she had inherited along with the rest. She understood now that this had been wrong. He had become hers. Not through ownership in any formal sense, but in the way that two lives become intertwined when they go through something difficult together and come out the other side. He had belonged to her the way the farm had always belonged to her, in the way that counted. got out of the truck and walked up to the porch and unlocked the door. The kitchen was quiet, and the kettle was where she had left it, and the table was where it had always been, and Earl's inventory volumes were in the cabinet by the stove. She put the kettle on. Outside the window, the fields ran toward the cedar trees, and beyond them the ridgeline ran north the way it had always run, indifferent and permanent, the way land is permanent when it is holding something for someone who is not yet ready to find it. She was still here. She was keeping the farm. That was all it had ever needed to be. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.